the things inside of us, each and every one of us, that we battle with, and we probably don't tell anybody else about it. Some of it is open, some of it is not. The men that we have here at Men of Valor who've gotten in from incarceration have tried to change their lives. They battled these things, the depression, the anxiety, the pornography, the addictions of all sorts. All these things have been a part of their lives. Now they've gotten out, and we're working with the help of God above to try to get that out of them. But they want to be open. They wanted to talk to you, to tell you about the things they're struggling with, and I bet in many cases it'll connect with all of us as we watch. All you have to do is press the button to subscribe and join us each and every week to listen to these men pour out of their hearts as they let their battle cries be heard.
My name is Keith Perkins. I've been at Men of Valor now for 21 days. My battle cry today is against resentment. On March 21st, 2000, I was arrested for aggravated robbery and ultimately pled guilty to a 40-year sentence in Texas. I had to serve 50% flat on that 40-year sentence to be eligible for parole. When I went to jail that night, I asked God into my life. I just knew that I needed to have help in my life in order for me to change. I made a decision that I was not going to be the same person that I went to prison as when I left. So in 2001, I was extradited to Nashville, Tennessee, for another aggravated robbery that I had committed in earlier 2000, February. And I ended up getting a 20-year sentence at 45%, ran consecutive to my 40-year sentence in Texas. So I had to go back to Texas and serve 19 more years on that 40-year sentence to be eligible for parole. So early in my incarceration period, I began to seek God. I started doing Bible studies, correspondence, and I started going to church every week. Every time the doors of the church would open, I would go to church. And we would have anywhere from 3 to 5 services between Friday and Sunday every week at the prison I was at. One day, early in my incarceration, I was on my dormitory and I was pouring a glass of water for coffee. And all of a sudden I became angry. And initially I didn't really catch it, but God brought it to my attention that the noise of that water pouring into that cup had brought anger into me, and I couldn't figure out why. So I began to pray about it, ask God to reveal to me why that sound of that water pouring into the cup made me angry. So about 2 or 3 weeks goes by, and all of a sudden God revealed it to me. It just came into my spirit. And what God revealed to me was that when I was young, me and my 2 siblings, my 2 sisters, would go to eat pizza at Pizza Hut every week on Friday with my mom and my stepdad. Well, my mom, she loved to drink her beer out of those frozen mugs that they had at Pizza Hut. And she would steal 1 or 2, however many she could get in her purse at the time, and take them back home, and she would put them in her freezer and she'd freeze them. And God brought back to my memory that when we would be sitting around the kitchen table, that my mother would begin to start drinking beer. And I knew that when my mother began to start drinking beer, that she was fixing to become another person. And so what God showed me was that when my mom would pop that top of that beer and begin to start pouring it into that mug, that sound that I heard triggered anger in me, because it brought up this resentment that I had towards my mother, because I knew that the alcohol was going to change who my mother was. So all those years later, God brought that to my memory, and So I just continued on my path that I was on, doing my Bible studies and going to church every week. Sometime a couple of years later down the road, I had a thought that came to my mind about my dad. And I would say that I was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3 or 4 years old. And I remember my dad took me and my two sisters to go pick up some hamburgers at this little hamburger joint in a little town called Iuka, Mississippi. And we pulled up into the front of the joint, and my dad went inside, bought a big old sack of hamburgers, got back in the car, and then pulled the car around to the back of the little restaurant. And there was a screened-in porch area on the back of the restaurant. And it was late in the evening. It was getting dark. And I remember seeing my dad looking around in the parking lot to see if anybody was looking, not really knowing at that time what he was up to or what he was doing. So he got out of the car and he walked over to the screened-in porch area and opened up the door, walked inside there, opened up a deep freeze, and reached in there and grabbed a bunch of meat. He got back in the car, threw the meat in the front seat of the car, and drove off. And it just suddenly occurred to me all these years later that what my dad was doing then was wrong, and I actually knew what he was doing then was wrong. But I was just too young to really understand at that time, but it was stored away in my subconscious memory. And so God began to start showing me that I had built a resentment and almost a hatred towards my dad and my mother due to those things that they had taught me. Because all those years later, while I had already been to prison 3 times prior to this incarceration, I had already spent more than half of my life incarcerated due to the bad choices that I had made in my life. The first thing I started doing at a young age was smoking cigarettes. And then I began drinking alcohol at the age of 11. I went to my first boys' home at the age of 11. And I went to my second boys' home at the age 12. And all the way up to the age of 17, I had ended up going to 4 boys' homes and 1 state school. All because my mother and my father had taught me how to drink alcohol and steal. Well, that opened the door up for drugs to come into my life. And I didn't realize, but all those years I had built this resentment up in my heart toward my mother and my father. I never had a relationship with my mother and father since my my early tween years. And so finally, in somewhere about 2015, I was able to finally just get down on my knees one night and ask God to forgive me for having that resentment and hatred towards my parents for those things that they had done. And that was probably one of the hardest things that I had ever had to do in my life. But instantly, after I had asked God to forgive me, I instantly felt this peace and calm come over me. And from that point on, I was able to understand what it means to forgive people for the things that they did to me in the past, and for the things that I had to go through in my life all those years later. And so while I was in prison during this 24 years and 2 months this time, I just consistently sought God through prayer and studies. And while I was in prison the whole 24 years, I was able to maintain that same state of mind from the very beginning. And I never once thought about going back to my old self and being the old person that I used to be. And to this day, while I'm at Men of Valor, I have also been able to just continue to walk my life in a forward path and not look back. So I look at resentment now as a thing that would really hinder a person with his walk with God. Where it's resentment can hold you captive and bind you in areas of your life where God needs you and needs to use you. And so to resentment, I speak against you. And to resentment, I say, get thee behind me. And I will never ever allow resentment to be a part of my life anymore. Because God has shown me how to overcome that.